Hey, Steve here. Just want to give you a heads up that this episode of Shaken contains some references to the horrors of war and may not be appropriate for younger or more sensitive listeners.
Purposely. Your life, God's purpose. Listen at purposely.com.
Welcome to the Shaken Podcast. I'm Steve Sunshine. Your confidence, your mood, your perspective, even your faith may be shaken because of something that's happened in your life. Jesus told us we'd have trouble in this world, so we're shaken but not surprised. He also said, "Take heart, I have overcome the world." In this podcast, you'll hear honest conversations with people who have or are going through life-altering hard times and have found that God was with them in the midst of it all.
This war has taken a toll on everybody, Steve. I think everybody in Ukraine knows somebody that lost a family member or has been impacted by this war. But what gives us the determination, the faith, and the ability to carry on, fight on, is really our love for our neighbor, right? The Bible says that a brother is born for difficult times, right? And that's really where you find out really who you are and what you're made of.
When loving your neighbor is more than inconvenient, when easing someone's suffering is actually dangerous, really, really dangerous, when it takes courage, how do you respond?
My name is Mikhail Pavenko. I was born in Ukraine. I came to the States as a little boy, and for a large portion of my life, I grew up in Tacoma, Washington. I have three uncles who are pastors in Ukraine of fairly large churches in East Ukraine. And in July of 2014, my uncle lost two of his boys to the Russian separatists. They came in, they take them hostage, tortured them, and killed them. And that really kind of raised my awareness of what's happening back home and led me to be a volunteer. And then I became a volunteer military chaplain with the Ukrainian military chaplain service.
Wow. I mean, that had to be devastating.
Yeah, it was devastating. That really hit our family pretty hard. And one of the things that's very overlooked in this war is the effect that this war has had on the Protestant community, the evangelical community. The Russian government basically said, "Hey, when we occupy your town, you have no right to be here. We consider you a Western religion." And their killing was it really made international and world news. And their killing was to instill fear into the Protestant communities of Ukraine. Hey, when we come into your town, if you're still here, you'll have the same outcome. And if we fast forward today, Steve, there was over 65 ministers that have been killed since 2014. Chaplains, ministers, priests, bishops, Sunday school teachers. We have over 630 religious buildings fully destroyed or damaged by Russian attacks. It's mainly only since the big invasion of 2022. Majority of them being Ukrainian Orthodoxy or especially the Baptist buildings, Baptist institutions have taken a very heavy hit. There's a large Protestant Baptist community in Ukraine currently.
So you're involved with chaplains that have been on the ground there. Tell us about that.
Yeah, sure. So my first trip to Ukraine, Steve, was actually in 2015. Right, I went through to kind of see how things are going. And at that point, I was doing a little bit of volunteering work, packing containers, aid, medical supplies. But then as time went on, I really felt called to mainly serve in the front lines, right? We mainly serve troops, the wounded, assisting with medical evacs, serving with the guys actually in the trenches, right? In there with battalions, brigades, detachments. And that led along in where I became I guess you can say a full-fledged military chaplain with the Ukrainians on a volunteer basis. I'm actually an American citizen, right? So I do a couple rotations in Ukraine per year. I just came from Ukraine a few weeks ago. I spent about a month in Ukraine per year.
So, what kinds of things? I mean, we can imagine, but you've experienced this
Yeah,
firsthand. What kinds of things do you encounter when you're talking with someone who's going through the war?
that's a great question. I'll share two things with you. This is a really genocidal war, Steve. Um,
Mm.
Russia is launching a majority of its attacks at nighttime on cities that are far away from the front lines. Talking about hospitals, schools, apartment buildings, air raids are happening constantly. I mean, people can't sleep. But one of the things that really impacted me this last trip, I was in the Zaporizhia region, southern Ukraine, and there was a school, like a kid's playground that was hit, right? And there was a young boy named Dmitry. He was 15 years old, and the Russians hit it with basically a rocket system, and it sliced the boy in half. I mean, decapitated him. And when I came there, I saw his mother, and she came just as we came there, right, to kind of see the place where her boy, unfortunately, lost his life. And I remember looking at her, and there was another chaplain that prayed with her. I I was speechless, to be honest with you. I gave her a little bit of money, and I hugged her, and she was still in shock that her boy, an absolutely innocent kid, just playing in the playground with other kids miles from the front lines, was murdered by absolutely an evil army. And I remember I gave her a hug, and I told her a couple nice things, and I hugged her father. And it was a really, really difficult time. Everybody kind of stood in silence. There was really no words. And one of the chaplains, Andre, he came over and he gave her a hug and he prayed for her. But if I ever lived in Ukraine full time, I think I'd be a military chaplain in the hospitals, right? Doing evacs, things like that. I came in this evacs where there's just blood gushing out, tourniquets, wounding guys any way you can. And I walked in a room, I remember, and there were probably 4 or 5 guys in that room. Most of them lost a leg or a limb, right, Steve? And I remember one of the soldiers, Steve, he gave me his phone. Says, "Hey, call my wife. Tell her she's coming here right now." He says, "But she's got no idea that I have no legs, no arms." He says, "Can you tell her that she doesn't lose it when she gets here?" And I said, "I can't do that for you. I couldn't do it." Without breaking down. And he says, no, no, no. He says, as a chaplain, I want you to take this phone, and I want you to call my wife and tell her that when you walk in the room, husband, father is not going to be how she is used to seeing him, right? And that was a difficult one. Long story short, I did not make that phone call. Somebody else did. And I kind of regret not making that phone call. But at that moment, I couldn't do it. But in the midst of that, Steve, the churches of Ukraine are alive and well. I'll just give you an example. 3 uncles of mine have churches that are in East Ukraine. They are a few miles from the front lines. Their churches are filled every Sunday with refugees, troops, volunteers, NGOs, medics, right? Their churches have become basically barracks for volunteers, chaplains, people that come from Western Ukraine, right, all over the world. They will rest at those churches, take a nap, right? Get ready and head out in the morning, come back home, eat, wash up.
How have you seen God working there? I know
Yeah,
it might be hard to identify because there's so much that's negative and violent and sad. But have you seen God working?
I have. I mean, I'll tell you a miracle that I have personally heard from many troops, and it's a well-known miracle in the Ukrainian community. The first days of the war, the southern part of Ukraine, for example, the Odessa region, right? It's a city that Mr. Putin wanted really, really bad. And if he would have took that city, it would have totally cut off Ukraine from even the Romanian side, right? The Moldovan side, where a lot of the aid comes in now, right? Because you got to understand, Ukraine's cut off now from the Black Sea, from the Azov Sea. All the ports are shut off. So the only way that aid gets into Ukraine is thank you to Poland, Romania, and Moldova. Those 3 friendly nations, right? That's how people enter and leave Ukraine. All the airports are closed off. But the Russians really, really wanted Odessa in the first days, weeks of the war, because that would have allowed them to basically encircle Ukraine from 75%, right? And then allow them to kind of choke it off. And the way that they were supposed to do that was through amphibious landings, right? Beach landings, right? Kind of World War II type. They have a lot of that equipment ready. But something happened amazing in the Black Sea during that time, during the time of March and April. That's considered kind of the glassy sea type season, right? Cold, but isn't a lot of wind out there. Very calm, exactly.
Yeah.
Steve, there were waves of 20, 25 feet during that time. And they could not get their ships close enough to have the Marines exit the amphibious ships. Does that make sense? And that allowed the Ukrainians, Steve, to rush troops down there, fortifications, the type of weaponry they had, and then to hold them off. And during that time, the West saw, okay, you know what, Ukrainians are actually putting up a fight here. They may hold off or maybe even win this thing with some aid. And Boris Johnson, he was then the Prime Minister of England, said, okay, we're going to give the Ukrainians the first Western weapons. And then America followed and other nations. And that's really the prayers of the churches. The fact that we're still standing today, Steve, is a miracle of God, and that really motivates folks to fight on for their home.
Have you run into, like, in individuals that you've had conversations with, any stories of them hanging on to faith, drawing strength to continue?
This war has taken a toll on everybody, Steve. I think everybody in Ukraine knows somebody that lost a family member or has been impacted by this war. As far as speaking with people that have been impacted by the faith and that have made the decision to carry on, practically every chaplain that I speak with, they said a lot of the chaplains, majority of chaplains in Ukraine are actually on a volunteer basis. He said, Mikhail, look at this. You know, we have to be crazy to be here, right? We're not getting paid. There's a good chance we may lose our lives, especially in my situation, right? Lord, forgive. Lord, have mercy if I become captive. I'm basically an American citizen. I carry an American passport. And but what gives us the determination, the faith, and the ability to carry on, fight on, is really our love for our neighbor, right? The Bible says that a brother is born for difficult times, right? And that's really where you find out really who you are and what you're made of. I actually spoke with a Red Cross volunteer, and she says, Mikhail, I've been in a lot of conflicts all over the world, right? Starting from, the Rwanda genocide back in the 90s, right? To the Middle Eastern wars, and there's been a lot of them. And she says, Mikhail, this is the most black and white war. I said, why is that? She says, because I see how you guys treat your prisoners, POWs. And there's actually kind of a scientific, almost way to explain that. She says, when you study the brain of an individual who's defending his house, right? He's doing it out of love. Does that make sense? He's doing it out of love. Then I've seen Russian prisoners in our hospitals. They are given the aid, they're given treatment, and they're treated very, very well. And that, I think, also is a testament that the nation itself, Steve, has not lost a humanity factor, which is so important, because once you lose the human factor, right, that's when you can lose the war too. It's basically hate for hate. And as chaplains, I think, honestly, our main job, sometimes I look at it, is to prevent that from happening, right? Here's what we tell the troops. We tell them this. If you came here to defend your land because you love your nation, that is a beautiful thing. God is with you. Biblically, you're doing the right thing. But if you came here out of hate to do evil to the other guy, when you catch him, you don't belong here. That is not what God blesses.
That's really good. I've always thought when things like that happen, and I have no military experience, so this is a total layman talking here, that a person, because they've seen their friends get shot and other horrible things, can be filled with enough anger when they capture someone that they're not thinking, they're not themselves. Do you sense that happening? The adrenaline, the fear, just all of that?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. And that really is, as the war goes on, as the emotions get higher, as the um, tiredness grows, weariness grows, that is one of the, I want to say now, almost the primary role of a chaplain is to not allow that to happen, right? In fact, some of the things that the commanders tell us are these things. They said, Mikhail, when we have chaplains that are assigned to our battalion, we see two things. We see motivation go up, and we
Mm.
see guys taking a bigger responsibility for their actions, right?
Mhm.
And we also see guys that are going to combat knowing very well why they are here. Um, uh, as chaplains, we're there to prepare them mentally, spiritually, and morally. We designate to them, hey, you, you are a servant of God, right? You are there to defend your nation, your children, your wife. That is what you do. But the moment if you take somebody captive and you do evil to them, like they're doing to us, God will take his blessings and his cover away from you. And nobody wants that. And we talk about those things very point blank and very, very clearly. And one of the things that really impressed me this last time go around and is how much freedom there is for ministers for pastors to basically have access to any government institution, especially military institutions right now in Ukraine, to spread the gospel and be that light. Because Steve, war is a very, very dark place, right? It's a
Yeah.
horrific place. It's a place where you can really become jaded, and it is so critical that chaplains, ministers, volunteers, medics are there with the right guidance and with the right outlook on the situation. Because here's the reality: war will end one day, right? I believe this Ukraine will win this war. God will give us victory. And then when you go home, will you be ashamed of the things that you've done or no? Does that make sense? And
Yeah.
that is we're always telling the guys, think of in terms of eternity. Does that make sense? We're Christians. We think in eternal terms.
Yeah.
Do not let one moment of anger um, let you do something that you will not be proud of, or that you
Yeah.
will regret.
Yeah. So many people have had those experiences where they've either seen something or had to do something or felt like they had to do it or didn't even though they didn't have, whatever. And those
Sure.
things can scar you. So we dealt with how you help people through anger. The other emotion that comes to my mind is fear. How
Mm.
do you help some? Because I mean that would just be human to be afraid in a situation like that. How do you help with that?
You know, the great question. Honestly, if somebody tells you they're not afraid, they're just lying to you. I mean, there's really no way to describe that in any other way, or they're just mentally not there. Fear is a normal feeling that we have as human beings, um, and it's not a bad feeling. Sometimes fear keeps you out of trouble, right? For doing something,
Yeah.
but fear is also it can inhibit you from doing something that is right.
Right.
Um, One of the things that I found that the troops told me, they said, Mikhail, I know that I can go out here and I can die. And I've had a lot of close calls too. But this last trip was by far the most scariest for me because the degree of the war has shifted to a point where, unfortunately, the Russians have also learned how to fight. And they have a lot of powerful weaponry from Iran, North Koreans, and they're building their own weaponry at the nation's basically on war footing. This was a really scary trip for me too. But one thing that really helps the troops out is guys are saying, "Hey, look, we know we're going to combat, right? And statistically, a lot of us or some of us will not come back. But what gives them a peace of mind is where they will go after they die here on Earth. Does that make sense? That really gives them a big peace of mind. Um, we explain to them in biblical terms that you are a minister of God who's carrying a weapon to protect his family. And you are defending. You are not murdering. You're not killing. You're defending. And that really takes away kind of that burden. Does that make sense? So when they go into combat being more confident and at peace with their heart, uh, they that takes away their fear. It's the fear still there, but allows them to be more focused on the mission. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Which is something that is so critical. I mean, it's kind of like, man, you've had those situations in your life, right, where you're doing something, but in the back of your mind, you're thinking about something else, and you really can't focus on the mission currently in hand. So, and really, that is the heart telling them, hey, you're not right with God here, right? You have to be right. And when they're right with God, and they understand where they're at spiritually with the Maker, that allows them to do their mission a lot better.
Have you had people come to know Jesus for the first time out in the field?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That is a very, very common thing. One of the things that we as chaplains do, we never press anybody, hey, you have to become a Christian, right? We don't do that. But when we're done with serving with the guys visiting a chalk or a detachment or a battalion, and we'll say, hey, can we pray for you guys? And almost 99.9%, some of the guys will say absolutely. I've only had one guy to me that was back in 2017. He was a Muslim guy, right? And he says, hey, he says, I don't believe in your God. I believe in Allah. I said, absolutely, no worries, absolutely. But he says, but can you guys still pray for me? That's what he said. And in the end, these are very, very quick prayers. These aren't, we're not out there speaking in tongues or anything. We're personally, how I do it is you always ask for the guy's permission, right? And I have
Sure.
we have these little prayer tracks that we give out to our troops, right? And they're very simple. In a time of fear, in a time of pain, in a time of sorrow, right? Or Psalm 90, right? We'll give them these things and they'll read them. And I always pray a prayer of protection. Takes about 30 seconds, right? And guys take their hats off, put the stickers down on the floor, put the weapons down, they bow their heads, and we say a quick prayer. And there's other chaplains that will say, hey, does anybody want to take Jesus as a personal savior if something happens, right? We never press anybody. And sometimes guys will say absolutely, or some guys will say, I'm already a believer. Thanks for visiting us. So the chaplain ministry isn't just about visiting and spending time with them. Even though we do that, we also bring aid, food, right, blankets, medical supplies. But our trip, our visit, always ends with a prayer. That is a rule of a chaplain service.
I think that's very powerful. It's a different situation, but I was on kind of a fundraising mission trip with a relief organization, and I had the chance to. This organization is Christian. They had taken in kids and helped kids, and there was a Muslim dad who was so thankful that these Christians were helping his kids, and we asked if we could pray for him, and he said yes, and I ended up praying the gospel over him, and I don't know what happened after that, but God may have done something with it. It's interesting how those differences, and our theological differences with other religions are very significant, but loving your neighbor is so powerful, and at least opens up the conversation or
Absolutely.
the opportunity to have some sort of community.
Absolutely, yeah. That's I would 100% agree with you. Sometimes just being there with them, right? In my case, I think it's a little bit unique. In my case, is I'll get there and our commander will say, "You know what, guys? We have a chaplain here today with us. His name is Mikhail Pavenko. He was born in Ukraine. He's an American citizen. He's living in America over 26 years." And the guys will be like, "Hold on a sec. What? You came here from there, right?
Yeah.
Like, are you crazy? Like, and you're with me here in the trenches? I mean, we can get taken out here in a minute." And that really motivates them. And they're like, "Wow, we are not forgotten." Does that make sense?
Yeah, you left a country that's not at war to come to their war. I can see where that would be astounding, that you would do that. That's much more powerful than just saying, hey, we wish you the best, or or whatever. You're actually in there with them. It's kind of like, I think about it, Jesus's response to sin and the spiritual battle against evil was to come here and be among us.
Yeah.
And in that sense, it's kind of a Christ-like thing to do, because you're identifying with their pain and their fear and everything else they're going through by being in it with them.
You actually kind of raised a good topic here. The ministry of chaplaincy, Steve, is at the very core is the ministry of presence. That's really what it's about. It's about being there with them. Does that make sense?
It sure does.
Sometimes we think we got to have an answer for everything in life, right? But in reality, if you really think about it, you don't have an answer for everything, and neither do I. And sometimes silence is a lot better than giving advice, right? Or trying to explain why. You remember the story with Job? Remember his friends? Remember?
Yeah.
Some people came and they gave him all these. This is for this, and this. But the other friends just came and then you sat with them, right?
Yeah.
They weep with them, and we all know which side made a bigger impact, right? And that's really what the chaplaincy ministry is about. It's the ministry of presence and of being there with them in this difficult time.
Do you have a family here in the U.S.?
Yeah, I have a wife. I've got 2 children. I live here in Vancouver, Washington, Clark County.
Okay.
And I do, a couple times a year since 2015. I'm on the front lines in Ukraine.
So they must have gotten used to you being gone, and are they? How do they feel or respond to you going into such a dangerous ministry?
Yeah, that is a great question. I can tell you right off the bat. My wife obviously worries.
Sure.
Got mom, dad live in Tacoma, family in Seattle, and they all worry. This is not a ministry there just to go get your PR status or take a couple likes on your Instagram, right? I mean, you got to be nuts to do that. This is truly a ministry that you're called for, and it's not a ministry for everybody, and that's not a bad thing. Some are called to be pastors, missionaries. Some are called to be teachers, evangelists. For the season of my life, I am called to be a military chaplain. This is where I'm at right now. Yeah, they worry. I'm sure my wife, my children, they pray for me daily.
How can we pray for you?
Well, that's a great question. I think when I pray, not to be selfish, I appreciate the prayers, but I'm praying for the people back in Ukraine right now. There's winter coming, right, Steve? And Ukraine has difficult winters. They are going to be struggling. One of the things that the Russians have done well, unfortunately, is they have decimated the Ukrainian energy system. Over 50% of its ability to generate electricity is gone, right? Their thermal stations, their power plants, substations are wiped out. In fact, this last time when I was in Ukraine, it was 120 degrees outside, 115, and people are without power for 12 hours a day, right? And they're in generators, they're on power banks, and now winter's coming. People are going to be freezing in their homes. And so when we pray, I pray for the people there. See, I pray for the churches that God would give them the courage, the strength, and I also pray that God will give protection to the Ukrainian military and that God would step in a miraculous way and end this war. God's done a lot of beautiful things in this war, ways to protect our nation, but I'm believing that God will step in mightily, and the enemy will flee. And we're believing and praying for that. So when I pray for the folks over there, pray for the chaplains, for the soldiers, pray for the families, for the widows, for the orphans. And I'm also praying for the churches of Ukraine, that they will continue to be that light, right? They are the real heroes, Steve. The pastors did not flee, right? The pastors that stayed with their people and their beautiful congregations have become basically a training center for missionaries, a hub for missionaries. And that's really when I think of the church that has outside the walls, right, that has moving feet and moving arms. That's the church that comes to my mind.
Mikhail, wow, I really appreciate you sharing your story, and thank you for the courage that you have and that you're willing to go and help those who are in need under very difficult circumstances. I think the more we hear about Christian believers doing the hard thing in life, whether it's, whatever it is, I think the better witness we have to a world that has lost a lot of faith in the idea that Christianity is even a good thing. So sure. I think your ministry is doing good in ways beyond what you've even intended.
Well, thank you, Steve.
Thank you for listening to Shaken. If you know someone who's asking questions like, why did God allow this to happen? Is God angry at me? What do I make of my suffering? Would you please share Shaken with them? You can help more people find Shaken by liking and subscribing and reviewing this podcast. You can find more episodes at purposely.com or wherever you get podcasts.